Well, just once again, Mark in two big divisions, and we're in the first of those divisions, and we've seen now the inauguration of his ministry. He's been baptized, he's been driven out, as Mark tells us, for his ordeal in the wilderness, and now in earnest, really, his ministry in Galilee gets underway, and as we've said, it will continue until about chapter 6. This is not a clear-cut line, but at least broadly, we sort of sense that he begins to move his focus elsewhere after he arrives in Nazareth, chapter 6, first 6 verses, and is rejected by his own hometown folks. And so that becomes, in a sense, this moment in which we begin to see a little bit of a shift away from Galilee. Last week we were noting that the first real incident that Mark wants us to reflect on is a twofold moment in which he, in both cases, exercises his authority, this unparalleled and inexplicable authority, the exousia, the weight. In the first instance, he calls disciples, "Follow me," and they are summoned. There's no conversation about it, no working out the details. They just drop everything. They're successful businessmen. They just drop it all and follow him. Authority drawing people to him. And then we immediately find ourselves in a situation where that same authority is going to repel someone from him. In this case, it is, of course, a demon, but we're going to see the same phenomenon throughout Mark, sometimes in various settings. The authority of Jesus divides us. How do you deal with the authority of Jesus? Do you accept it joyfully, or do you resent it? Do you sometimes feel that Jesus is putting his nose in where he doesn't belong? Do you have that sense sometimes? That's kind of the way his authority is. And certainly we see some of that already going on here. We looked at these verses last week. They came to Capernaum. On the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue. These people were astonished. I'll remind you of that word. It's the word that describes, in the pagan world, a god smiting someone. They were smitten. They were struck. The word almost implies the notion of being knocked over. It's a very strong word, fairly rare in the New Testament. But Mark wants to impress us. This was already in their minds. What is this weight, this authority by which this man is speaking to us? He teaches as one having authority, not as the scribes. It's not derivative authority, which the scribes would exercise, but intrinsic authority. He speaks out of his own great substance. And that seems to be what was so striking to these. All right, the story continues. Now there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out. There was a demon in the church. You ever suspected that? The place of worship is never perfect. We might like it to be perfect, but it never is. The world likes to point that out to us. Outside the doors of this building, you don't have to walk very far to find people who'll say, "Oh, I don't go to church, it's full of hypocrites." I always say, you got that right. That's for sure. Just like hospitals are full of sick folks. The difference is, it's not just the church that has hypocrites. The whole world is full of hypocrites. You notice that? Everywhere you go, you run into hypocrites. Some of them are in the church. And that's where they ought to be. I'm a hypocrite. I'm glad I'm here. I need this medicine to help me become more integrated with the deep deceit that I find swirling around my own psychology day and night. So we're not too surprised to find out something was imperfect in the synagogue. Jesus isn't waiting around for a perfect place to preach his first sermon, you see. He goes to the best place available, and this point it was an imperfect synagogue with a demon-possessed man right in the middle of it, and that's where he begins to speak, and that's where people begin to feel the authority of his presence. If you visit Capernaum, you will see this structure, so I am told. And it is called the White Synagogue. It is not the synagogue where Jesus was preaching that day, but it is at least apparently built on the remains of that synagogue, and this is thus called the White Synagogue at the location of what was originally called the Synagogue of Jesus. So this is kind of the setting at least. There is an unclean spirit who cries out. It's very interesting the way Mark puts this. It's not the typical way you would describe it. And again, it's Mark's very deep, kind of subtle awareness of the words he's using. It says here, it doesn't say the man had an unclean spirit, that it was with him. It doesn't even say that the spirit was in the man, but what it actually says is the man was in the unclean spirit, you see. As if to imply in its grasp, a stranglehold, gripped this man. It's very similar to the wording that the Apostle John will use in 1 John chapter 5 when he says the whole world is in the evil one. That there's a sense in which being in something means being under its complete domination, and in that sense, that's what we're supposed to understand of the condition of this man. Now this harkens back to a theme I was trying to get on the table last week, that the idea that hell had controlled this world by our nomination of him as our new king in the Garden of Eden, that had continued. And in a sense, as John says, the whole world was in the evil one. Ever since that moment that he was able to become, as the Bible calls him, the prince of this world, or the prince of the power of the air, this evil one had been dominating. And in some ways, this demon-possessed man in this synagogue on this occasion is microcosmic, representing, in a sense, the condition of the whole world that Jesus confronts. This is the first head-to-head contest between the power of Christ, the kingdom of Christ, and the kingdom of this world. It will culminate, as Revelation tells us later, when the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. But now this is the first skirmish, you see. And Jesus meets his enemy in the synagogue. The man was said to be, or the spirit was said to be unclean. It's an odd expression, isn't it? We might expect an evil spirit or some such thing, but typically in the New Testament, these spirits are called unclean spirits. And if we're thinking about the Old Testament, we immediately recognize that there is a kind of echo of the Old Testament distinctions between the clean and the unclean. You know, if you've read Moses lately, especially Exodus, especially Leviticus, and parts of Numbers and Deuteronomy, you'll find that there are all kinds of elaborate discussions of those things that are clean and those things that are unclean. We sometimes, reading it, are a little put off by it. You ever notice that? It just seems like, wow, this is way over the top, Moses. All of these pedantic little distinctions between this and that, and how the priest was supposed to evaluate mold and supposed to evaluate leprosy, and we start thinking all of these details of the clean and unclean start sounding more like cultic taboos than divine revelation. You ever notice? I don't know. Are you put off by that? Have you ever noticed that? It just seems like it's a little over the top. And we sometimes wonder, why in the world is there so much in the Old Testament about this notion of being unclean? Well, we can get lost in the details, but there is a sub-theme to it, and it really does continue all the way through the Old Testament. It reaches its culminating expression and meaning in the New. Because there is this idea that the world is in the grip of Satan, and Satan is not clean. And so the whole world, in a sense, has become tainted, diseased, infected by this prince of the power of the air who is reaching every detail of life here. And the redemptive scheme in the Old Testament has a little bit of a geographical sense to it. It's as if to say God inserts himself into this unclean, unhealthy, diseased, contaminated place and creates a little sterile field. The doctors in the room, you know that before you go into surgery, you scrub up. And you scrub up better than I've ever washed my hands in my life. I mean, you really go at it, you know. Because what do you want? You want a sterile place. You don't want the infection that is out there everywhere to invade this one little spot. It's going to be protected from it. And in a sense, that's what happens in the Old Testament. God is creating through His people a sterile place, a clean place. And He wants them to be quite aware of the difference between the clean and the unclean. And there's a sense in which outside the camp is an unclean place. So we come inside to this sterile place, this place of cleanliness. And the word that's used in the Old Testament to capture the idea of a clean place is the word holy. So the temple is said to be the holy place. And within it is the Holy of Holies. That's to say, morally sterilized, morally pure. But you see, where the devil goes, he wants to make things dirty. And hence we hear of an unclean spirit. I was reflecting on this, and it reminded me of an incident that took place a few years back when I was practicing law. And I'm going to tell you a short story about someone. I'm not going to mention the name, but some of you may actually recognize it because it was in the press and quite well known at the time. But I had been doing some plaintiff's work, and there was a particular defense lawyer in town, and I had several occasions to have dealings with him. And I liked the guy. He was reasonable. We'd negotiate to resolve cases, and I thought he was unlike some defense lawyers. Actually had a rational... Oh, I won't go off there. Okay, anyway, but anyway, I liked the guy. I thought this we can work together, and we had successfully, 2 or 3 cases. I was stunned one day when I was glancing at the paper and I saw that man's name, and the article was saying he had just been disbarred. And I couldn't believe, I was astonished. And I started reading the article and found out this tragic story that this man, who had been really competent and highly respected in the Bar Association and so on, had gotten in trouble with drugs and was using heavily to the point that his addictions actually drug him across that line where he violated the ethical rules outright that govern lawyers, and bam, when it was discovered, he was disbarred right there. There was an interesting kind of follow-up story. I don't think this was in the paper. I think I just heard this from separate sources, but it describes some people who went to his house after all of this had happened. And he was in treatment. And these folks went to his house, and as they approached the house from the outside, it looked absolutely lovely. The grass was manicured. The bushes were neatly trimmed. Everything looked picture perfect. They walked up the sidewalk to the front door. They had a key. They opened the door, and they thought they had just walked into a different universe. They were almost immediately nauseated by the stench that assaulted them as they opened the door. The animal droppings all over the house, the furniture that was totally destroyed, the entire inside of it looked like something that would have come out of the worst third world situation you can imagine. And the sort of cognitive dissonance that was described of these folks standing in the door and looking one direction and seeing grass, loveliness, well kept, well manicured, and looking just 90 degrees in the opposite direction and seeing what looked like something out of hell. The devil wants to make your life dirty. Wherever he goes, he makes things dirty. He's a dirty creature. He's unclean. Now, the first time he attempts to get inside you, it won't be so obvious. He'll come along as a very innocent character, offering you some very innocent, kind of attractive things. But as the old saying goes, he won't be satisfied until he leaves you face down in a gutter somewhere. He wants sin to become exceedingly sinful in your life. He's an unclean character. And we're not surprised that this unclean character is called through his minions an unclean spirit. And that's what this guy was in the presence of Jesus. And he cried out. The impression that Mark gives us is that this cry was sort of the primal shriek. It was immediate, it was involuntary, it was just the shriek of terror. You know, when you walk out in your backyard and flip over a big rock and you see all of those little creatures that are running for cover because they hate the light. And that's kind of the feeling you get here. Light has just walked into this place. Authority has just opened its mouth and begun to speak, and there's this shriek of terror that comes out. It was a reaction to Jesus' teaching. It wasn't a reaction necessarily to any particular thing that he said. This is what's interesting about Mark. He's just interested in the fact that when Jesus speaks, there is weight to those words. And this demon reacts. Some commentators have paralleled this incident with what the audience to whom Mark was writing probably experienced. Because they, especially those living in Rome originally, were dealing with what, at least by all appearances, was a demon running the Roman world, Nero. He had, by best evidence, been responsible to burn about a third of the city of Rome. He, of course, denied it. But it was an odd coincidence that about 2 days later he brought out blueprints for how he wanted to rebuild that and change the name of Rome to Neapolis and call it, in honor of himself. The circumstantial evidence was pretty compelling, and most people saw right through the ruse of his denials. But why the Christians? These were the least offensive. Probably of all the people in Rome, they had the greatest ability to at least acknowledge his role as an authority, even though he hardly deserved anybody's respect. They paid their taxes, they drove the speed limit, they were model citizens in every respect, and yet he targets them. What is it about Christians that draws that kind of hostility, the primal shriek of hell itself against Christians? And what he did to them was offensive even to the pagan audience. Tacitus, who had no great affection for Christians, just laments the way that Nero treated them, taking them to his garden parties, men, women, and children, pouring tar all over them while they're still alive, lighting them on fire, hoisting them up to light his garden parties. Isn't that great fun? He was a demon by all external appearances. And for these Christian people reading the Gospel of Mark to hear that the first thing Jesus did as he began his ministry was meet the primal shriek of a demon from hell must have given them some encouragement as they anticipated what might be their own situation there in Rome. Well, this moment, this confrontation between heaven and hell, between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness, is thematic. And the whole story that Mark is going to unfold for us, with all of its interesting details and little eddies and currents along the way, still does seem to be an extension of what he's setting before us here. The demon cries out, "Let us alone. What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." When I read this to you before, it's in the New Revised Standard Version. This is the New King James. I'm just giving equal opportunity. There's a lot of great translations out there. This one includes, reflecting the King James traditionally, that first expression, "let us alone." I think the best evidence is that was not part of Mark's original text. It seems to have been brought into the text by a copyist sometime later and seems to have been borrowed from Luke's version of this story. So I'm going to omit it. And what I want you to focus on are the three questions that are posed by this, or two questions and a statement really, that are posed by this demon. There's a movement to them. There's a kind of progress, a kind of increasing insight, if you will, that seems to be reflected in each of these questions. The first one is, what do we have to do with you, or what do you have to do with us? You could view it either way, but it is, in the final analysis, what right do you have to be here? What are you doing here, is it. As if spoken by someone who is in his own proper domain, and this person has no business showing up in my place, you see. I don't know if anyone's ever asked you that question. What are you doing here? You ever been, I wasn't going to tell this story, and Candy will probably regret that I didn't confer with her first, but a few months ago we were in a hotel. We were over in Seattle visiting our kids, and I like to get up early in the morning, and so probably about 6 a.m., which isn't that early, I was downstairs looking for coffee. I mean, come on. And I was kind of poking around, and I saw what was obviously a nice jug of coffee, thermos. It was hot coffee. It was like it had printed all over it, "Have some." I put my little cup under it. Godson was walking back down the hall, and this big guy, about 25 years old, big guy, steps out, looks at me. He's about 10 feet away, and he says, "What are you doing here?" That's what he said to me. I thought he was going to cuff me. Really, I thought I'd had it. It was not a happy situation. I don't know the last time I've been asked that question, but that did carve itself into my psyche at that moment. What are you doing here? You been asked that question? That's the demon's first response. Wait, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. We don't have anything in common. This is my place. You go somewhere else. You go to your place. Almost as if there's a suspicion that this demon is now facing eviction, and he thinks, wait a minute, I've got squatter's rights. I have a right to be here. Go somewhere else. But then you get the feeling there's a little bit of a gradual recognition something else is going on. And the demon's next statement or next question reflects somewhat more insight. Have you come to destroy us? Throughout the Old Testament, there is a notion that this world, of course, is under the control of this satanic character, this joint accuser and prosecutor, this tempter, this one who seems like inappropriate control over this world. But there's always this sort of hidden, rather subtle idea that someday the jig will be up. Someday time is going to run out. And you get the feeling as you read the Old Testament that these champions come along to try to undo the power of Satan, but somehow every time he comes out on top. Sometimes it's a close call, but it seems like he always is able to, as the expression goes, kick the can down the road a little bit further, keep postponing his own doomsday, keep, just putting it off a little bit. But the idea that someday it would be over is sort of built into the biblical narrative. You see a hint of that later when Jesus is dealing with the Gadarene demoniac. And he says, have you come to destroy us before the time? The Greek word, the kairos, the appropriate moment, almost as if accusing Jesus, you're here too soon, And a little bit of that almost is sneaking through this text. Have you come to destroy us? Is that why you're here? Almost as if to question whether Jesus has legitimate rights. Has the when, finally been realized? What's going on here is a theme that Mark is going to be playing with again and again. Satan is viewed as a kind of strong man whose goods are going to be plundered, but he has to be bound, first of all, by a stronger man. And now you have two strong men in this conflict. And when is one going to succumb to the other? But then, of course, the deepest and most powerful statement, almost an epiphany, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And that gets us right into the very heart of one of the deepest ideas for Mark and for all the Scripture. This is your Greek lesson for the day. Ho, that little backwards apostrophe is called a rough breather. So when you see that, you give an H sound. So it's like H-O. Ho. Next word has the same thing. Hagios means Holy One. To, genitive case, of Theou, God. The Holy One of the God. It's a very strong expression. We don't usually translate the definite article with the word God into English. So we don't hear the Holy One of the God, we just hear the Holy One of God. But in the Greek, when that definite article is present, as it is here, it's a way of saying to the reader, this is not just gods in general, the gods of this world, idolatrous type God. This is the true God. And the fact that there are two definite articles used in this short phrase, the Holy One of the God, is getting us very close to an idea of one who is uniquely, powerfully holy. And that becomes this confession, as it were, of a demon. You know, because you're good Presbyterians, that the defining quality of God, the most important descriptive adjective that's applied to God in the Scriptures, is that He is holy. Now, I mention that to you because you also know that if you just go out and do a few man-on-the-street interviews in Spokane or anywhere, and you just ask people casually, hey, what's the most important word you could use to describe God? You're most likely going to hear what? God is love. God is loving, you know. It's a very popular idea. You always want to ask them, where'd you get that idea? Was that Vietnam that taught you that? Well, where'd you get the idea God is love? That's a biblical idea, you know. You don't get it by just looking at the condition of the world. You don't study ISIS and conclude, oh, God is love, you see. Where did that? It's a biblical idea, but if you say God is fundamentally a loving being, you've just created an idol. Because the Bible has a whole lot to say about God besides that He's loving. In fact, even in 1 John, before John says God is love, he says God is light. We don't hear that so much, do we? We like the ones that are appealing to us. But before any of those words, the word that the Bible really emphasizes is that He's holy. You go back to Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah's there, sees a vision, one seraph calls to the other, holy, holy, holy. The whole earth is full of His glory. The word glory is unveiled, visible holiness. That repetition of the word glory or holy 3 times in a row is called the trace hagion in theology. The repetition of that word 3 times, which in Hebrew literary structure meant no word could be more emphatically stated than this one. No other description of God is ever put in those ways. That's the only word ever used in that way. This is the ultimate conditional qualifier for anything else we say. God is love for sure, but it's holy love. God is wrathful, but it's holy wrath, you see. The New Testament repeats it. Revelation chapter 4. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who is and who was and who is to come. And you think about how deeply the idea of holiness is written into the DNA of our Christian experience. You know, many of us after this Sunday school class this morning are going to go into worship. And we're going to do so in a room that is commonly called the sanctuary, from the Latin word sanctum, which means holy place. Many of us are going to go into that room carrying a Bible. What's it called? The loving Bible, right? Isn't it? It's a holy Bible. And if we read that holy Bible, we'll find that throughout the Scriptures we're told again and again, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if I were to say to you, oh, by the way, next summer I'm going to go visit the Holy Land, where would you take that to be? Las Vegas? Atlantic City? Where? We all know it, don't we? There's only one holy land in the classical understanding of that term, because that's where God put His thumbprint historically. And in that holy land was a holy place, and within that holy place was a holy temple, the very core of which was called the Holy of Holies. And again, the Bible just hits us with this idea. That's the answer to the question. And this demon sees it before anybody else does. Seeing in that spiritual truth to which most folks were blind at this moment, the deep reality of this one. I know who you are, the Holy One of the true God, you see. This is almost an affirmation of deity. I would say it is, but people who are hostile to that idea would differ. But I don't quite understand how anyone could own that term and not be committing I mean, let's just face it. If I came in here on a Sunday morning, come on. If I got up in front of Sunday school on some Sunday morning and I said to you folks, okay, everybody, I just want to get one thing on the table before we get started this morning. I am the Holy One of God. Okay, now there's two responses, either of which is fine. Call some of the fine psychiatrists that we have in this church and cart me away to a safe place. Or you can just toss me through that window, which would be just fine as well. Who could imagine owning such a blasphemous thing unless indeed they were nothing less than God himself walking among us, the Holy One of God? That was Isaiah's term for God, the Holy One of Israel. And here, something like it is assigned to Jesus. It doesn't come from a disciple or a follower. It comes from a demon, first of all. There's only one other time, I'm indebted to Jim Edwards for pointing this out, only one other time that we have anything quite like this applied to a human being, and it happens to be Samson. Samson is not called the Holy One of God or even anything quite like it, but he is called a Nazarite to God, Judges 16:17. And to be a Nazarite was to be one who had taken a vow of holiness. You're probably familiar with that from your biblical studies. He's the only one that's given a title something like that in all the scriptures. And Jim points out, it's really quite interesting, isn't it, that if you think of the strong man in the Old Testament, you think of Samson, a Nazarite. And Jim plays with that and thinks, do you think anyone put together that Jesus was the Nazarene, the Holy One of God? Same Hebrew word, basically, coming on as the new, greater, ultimately superior Samson, the strong man, who has now shown up and who is going to bind the strong man of this world. We're going to see this brought to a sharp point just a couple of chapters hence. Mark chapter 3, verse 27. Jesus says, no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then he can plunder his house. Jesus comes as this strong man, and he's going to bind a less strong man and plunder his goods so that the kingdom of this world will become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. I think that's what Revelation 20 is saying. An angel came down from heaven, Christ himself, certainly, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the serpent, that ancient dragon who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, threw him into the abyss, locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations any longer. And I say to you, anywhere that the gospel of Christ has been faithfully preached, Satan runs for cover. And his ability to deceive people with a spooky universe filled with superstitious characters is just evaporates against the light of the world who's sin. But you take Christ out of a culture and you start seeing the spooks showing back up. I had a few at my door last night. No, not really. Jesus rebuked him. Listen. Jesus rebuked the demon. Be quiet. I think the Greek here was probably a little bit more abrupt. Shut up. Who do you think you are? Speaking that way. You just said, I'm the Holy One. You close your mouth. Come out of him. Jesus speaks without any negotiation. Let's sit down and see if we can cut a deal here. No incantation. There were certainly exorcists running around loose in the first century, and we've seen them throughout. You'll notice most of the time they operate on the basis of potions, magic words, occult arts, other kinds of dark wizardry. Not Jesus. He doesn't utter some magic words, sprinkle some Be quiet. When someone just tells you to be quiet, the last person that talked to me like that was my mother. Unconditional authority right there, you see, and isn't that true? When one person tells another person to just be quiet, there's a power to that. No consideration, no quid pro quo, no this for that, I'll do this if you'll do that. Jesus just exercises unilateral, irresistible authority. He won't even permit good words to come from this evil mouth. He won't even permit good theology You are the Holy One of God. That was sure true. But Jesus will not hear it from this demonic source. And then he says, come out. Let go of your grasp, your hold on this world. And in a sense, what's happening here is thematic of what Christ is ultimately going to do at the cross when he'll say, get out. Strong man, your house is plundered. And when he rose from the dead, he could say with a straight face, now all authority is given unto me, you see. And Satan has lost his place. Part of the message that is in this statement, get out, is that there is no part of human experience or human life that is outside of Jesus' interest. And that has been a little bit of a thorny problem down through Christian history. Every time Christian people have begun invading areas where they're not supposed to be. Back in the early centuries of the church, slavery was absolutely common. More people were slaves than free in the ancient Roman world. But Christians, it didn't take them long to start raising the issue. And they were being told, wait, what do you have to do with this? Those great characters in late 1800s England, John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, former slave trader, William Wilberforce, the MP, working together, laboring day in and day out to bring to an end the slave trade in England. You know what they were told over and over? You have no business here. What are you doing here? This isn't your concern. Go home. Don't mess with our prophets. Go back to your church. Read some Bible verses. Pray together. Turn down the lights and don't bother us. This is business. This is prophets. And they just kept at it, and the gates of hell didn't resist the force of their simple proclamation, words. They didn't have bazookas. They just had the power of the truth of God. Legalized discrimination. Jim Crow laws in America were challenged for the most part by a Christian conscience. I hope some of you know the name Vishal Mangalwadi. He's become one of my heroes. He's probably the leading Christian philosopher, apologist in India today. He grew up in India. He grew up surrounded by Hinduism. And even as a young man, before his conversion to the Christian faith, he was so taken with the Hindu gurus. Saffron robes, holy, living almost like they just floated above the ground. They were so amazing, mystical. But he says even as a young man, he was sort of troubled because he would see these gurus walking down the sidewalks of Calcutta, right beside children who were starving to death, just a couple of feet from their own path, and they didn't even see them or care. They were untouchable, outside the interest of such a holy person. And Vishal Mangalwadi notes, it struck him as interesting that it took a Christian to go to India and touch the untouchables. It took Mother Teresa in the name of Christ to break those social barriers. And a lot of people said to her, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. This is not your place. You're a nun. Go back to a convent somewhere. See, but she wouldn't do it. Christian people have been making a nuisance of themselves through history. Housing issues, addictive amusements. When I first joined this church in 1980, the pastor was our beloved, now with the Lord, Dick Leon. One of the first things I learned about this Presbyterian pastor was he was on a one-man campaign to fight pornography in the city of Spokane because he knew how destructive it can be to men especially to their marriages. And he was courageously out there in many ways on his own, carrying on that battle. People were saying to him, what are you doing here? What right do you have to be here? Don't mess with our prophets. Jesus said, come out. Christians have been saying down through history, come out, let go. You're defeated. You're out of here. Well, he came out. When the unclean spirit had convulsed him and cried out with a loud voice, he came out of him. The word that's translated convulsed means to be torn. I mentioned to you a word for tear, schizo, which occurs twice in Mark, once at the beginning, once at the end. This is a different word, but it's almost as dramatic. The spirit tore him. This was like the demon's last gasp. It was his demonic tantrum. He didn't want to let go. It's hard to let go of what has become your home, but you're only a squatter, demon. Get out. You don't belong here. You are evicted. And no more words were permitted from the demon, just that last gasp, and it came out. The only obedience could follow from this authoritative pronouncement of Christ. Well, Mark begins to wrap up this story, and if you want to know what the writer wants you to get out of the story, then it's helpful to read the last thing he says. And here, this is where Mark is putting a little point on the whole story we've just reviewed. They were all amazed. Different word than that word of being smitten. This is thaumazo. It's a strong word, a much more broad word. They were all astonished. They were amazed. This is in the imperfect tense, and they were questioning among themselves. It wasn't just one question. The place was abuzz. They were asking each other, what is this? What had just happened to them was so outside the scope of their experience. They couldn't help but ask, what is this? Something different, something unprecedented. Doctrine. And notice what he said. It's not a new power, it's a new teaching. The authority of Jesus here was first and foremost in his words, his teaching. This new doctrine. With authority, he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. They were all amazed. This, of course, is the first thing Mark wants us to get out of this. The authority of Christ leaves them all stunned. He also wants us to note the connection to Jesus' words and Jesus' power, so that the authority of Jesus' words is the same as the authority of his works. Jesus has both. He exercises both. And in some ways, when you hear Jesus' authoritative words, you are feeling something of his authoritative work. Paul Achtemeier, the commentator, says, Jesus' teaching and acting authenticate each other. They are of a piece. They are the same thing. It certainly, I think, was in Mark's mind that we should be thinking about the Old Testament and how frequently the Messiah would come and his power would be in his words, which is sometimes poetically expressed as the rod of his mouth. He shall smite them with the rod of his mouth. Isaiah writes, Isaiah chapter 11, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. Those are his words. And Mark's hoping we're thinking about that as we hear now this moment in the synagogue. With the breath of his lips, he shall slay the wicked. Isaiah 49, that great messianic chapter in Isaiah, Messiah speaking. He has made my mouth like a sharp sword. We hear in Revelation the sword that comes out of the mouth of the rider on the horse. In the shadow of his hands he has hidden me. He's made me a polished shaft, an arrow, you see. In his quiver he's hidden me. And finally, of course, this famous text that Jesus will read eventually in Nazareth, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. And we're supposed to hear in this, when Jesus preaches, things happen. Conditions change. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim speech, liberty to the captives. Things happen. The captives are liberated. The opening of the prison for those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the day of the vengeance of our God. These people in the synagogue say, even the unclean spirits obey. It's as if this is the most astonishing part of it. Even unclean spirits obey, and this becomes for them irrefutable proof of the presence of God's kingdom. You look at the miracles that are performed by Jesus. that are reported to us in the New Testament. And what's interesting is while he is certainly one who was characterized as a miracle worker, that's probably the most fundamental thing anybody knew about Jesus, every miracle that he performed had been in some sense or other already performed earlier in Israel's history by the Old Testament reckoning. He healed people, people had been healed before. He raised the dead, people had been raised from the dead before. He performed miracles involving nature, nature miracles had taken place before. People had been fed by multiplication of food before. All of the miracles that Jesus performs were not unprecedented, with one exception. There's no record in the Old Testament of anyone casting out demons, you see. All of a sudden, we've got something on the scene here which has no parallel. The New Testament comments on that. This is in Luke's Gospel now, but listen to what Jesus says. If I cast out demons with the finger of God, surely the kingdom of God has come upon you. When a strong man, he continues, fully armed, guards his own palace, his goods are in peace, but when a stronger man than he comes upon him and overcomes him, he takes from him all his armor in which he trusted and divides his spoils. Jesus comes with the very finger of God, casting Satan out. This strong man lost his grip. And that great moment in human history, never to be repeated, doesn't have to be, was started now in this moment. Well, Jesus picked up rock star status right off the bat. Immediately, his fame spread throughout all the region of Galilee. He was an overnight sensation. This incident spread like wildfire throughout Galilee. His fame spread. Jesus was catapulted, in a sense, into a guy that would summon the crowds to him, and we're going to start seeing how that plays out next week as we continue. All right, Sunday school lesson for the morning, friends. We all have our demons. I don't know what yours are. I'm not going to tell you what mine are. And I have three little sort of obvious little exhortations for you with respect to whatever the demons are that are giving you problem. First of all, recognition. I don't know about you. Whenever I start thinking about the demons in my life, I always like to go to a very special place, my happy place. It's right beside a lovely river called Denial. And I love to hang out there and just ignore those sinister little movements. I want to just pretend that they're not really important, minimize them, ignore them, put them away, hide them. This all begins when we recognize and then confess. Confess means to say the same thing, to put the same analysis on that little demon, whatever it is, that God does. God doesn't minimize it. God doesn't say, this is just an incidental, don't worry about it. This is not God's assessment. And when I begin attaching the same significance to that little thing, whatever it may be, where I'm compromising with hell itself, when I begin to assess it in any sense according to the proportions that God does, then it's going to cause me to repudiate it in the name of Christ through the power of His Word. You know very well that when Jesus was being tested by the Satan, he met that temptation with the Word of God. That is the rod in the mouth of Messiah. Its power is incontestable, and it is the use of God's Word in your life that will give you the ability to do what Jesus said. If your hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, gouge it out. Hyperbolic language that's intended to shock us, but it's also supposed to say to us, don't play games with the demons in your life. Get rid of them. Not by incantations, not by negotiations, not by compromises, but by repudiation through the power of Christ's Word. Jesus did it in the first century in a synagogue in Capernaum. You can do it any day of the week in your life as we just obey God's call so to do.